I greet you in the name of the risen Christ whom Aaron read about. The dawn is just beginning to announce itself. Only a few are already out. Who goes into dark streets mere hours after a riot has ended in a bloody execution? What kind of person risks everything to venture into enemy territory, a place that holds the remains of the one considered so controversial, a political insurrectionist, identified as the king of the Jews in the middle of the Roman Empire? Who does that? Their names are Mary of Magdala, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and a few additional unnamed but very courageous women. This was the first day of the week. The day prior, their Sabbath, will have been spent observing the traditional expectation of rest, but particularly this week would most certainly have included reliving the trauma of the past hours. All research tells us that crucifixions were horrific events. So to have these women venture out by themselves is bold. We have seen bold, courageous people step into the public square to fight for protection, human treatment, human rights, equal treatment, even when it has been treacherous to do so. We need only remember the day of and the weeks following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. The people whom we saw testify at the trial of the accused police officers moved us as they recounted the brutality that occurred that day and many, many days before that, and the trauma that now accompanies them every waking moment of every day. Who does that? Who testifies? Who protests? Who keeps inserting themselves into the heart of controversy and into the line of fire? People who have a cause, who long for a change. No, people who demand a change. As Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. What did the Minneapolis protesters have to lose? What did the women who witnessed Jesus' crucifixion have to lose? They had already lost everything. We must remember, those of us who are familiar with the story of resurrection, that the women were expecting to pay tribute to a fallen leader, their inspiration, their only hope for change, their trusted friend. They were there to mourn their own loss as well, their loss of purpose, because their mission had died and was buried with Jesus. They came prepared only with embalming spices for the dead, their commitment and their love. Somewhere they had developed a level of persistence that puts a lot of us, maybe most of us, to shame. They were not expecting a surprise. They were not expecting a sudden change. They were not hope-filled. They were expecting the ordinary, if you can call paying tribute to one who's been executed ordinary. Everything was dark that morning, not just the nighttime sky. Being confronted with two brilliantly shining figures in this darkness was absolutely not reassuring to them. It was terrifying. But the two figures spoke to them directly. Why do you search for the living among the dead? Jesus is not here. Christ is risen. With this reminder, the words of Jesus came back to them. We know those aha moments when our brains kind of kick in and try to fit new information into these mental places. I think that's what happened with them. Our text says that it was then that they remembered what Jesus had said. Sometimes a message sounds so outrageous before the fact that we can't comprehend it because we don't have a context. It seems like nonsense or something that we really need to argue It's not rational. That's ridiculous. You'll die? First absurd claim. And you'll rise after 3 days? Ludicrous. Resurrections don't happen. Everyone knows that. Healing of threatening diseases doesn't happen. Everyone knows that. Coming out of abuse safely is virtually impossible. Everyone knows that. Belonging as a person with a disability, a different skin color, mental health challenges, having come out as gender nonconforming just doesn't happen. Everyone knows that. But then resurrection happens. Something happens. Darkness gives way to light, gradually, breathtakingly, yet ever so steadily and securely. Light bursts forth when there is no known way forward. Now, in the dark, confronted by two terrifying beings, these women were in a context where Jesus' words began to fit into place, not completely, but in bits and pieces. Could it be? They weren't locked into eternal despair after the death of their life-giving teacher and friend. Maybe, just maybe, something had happened. These women didn't magically appear in the right place at the right time. They had a history of making hard decisions. They had followed Jesus for years, placing them in uncomfortable and dangerous situations. The crucifixion would have been a culmination of all of that. Now they were in another hard place, doing the hard thing, listening to this pull toward intentionally walking the road of grief, paying their last respects, even though they knew the danger of that. They did this, went back to the place where they had last seen their loved one. Something happened. The resurrection of Christ had already happened, but now it was time for theirs. As we know, courageous decisions immediately generate headwind, strong opposition, whether that comes from within or from the outside. Already on their walk to the tomb, they had debated about how they were going to deal with that stone that covered the mouth of the tomb. Probably it was a what if this, what if that kind of conversation. I can't imagine what possibilities they came up with, but this is an example of how a discussion of what ifs can be completely futile. The stone was already gone. Something had already happened. Where were the guards? The women didn't know that the guards feared for their lives now that they had witnessed an astounding occurrence and had done nothing to prevent it. In fact, they weren't able to do anything to prevent it. These men had immediately reported this most unbelievable tale to the highest religious leaders. The 28th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew tells that story. So what solution did the religious leaders offer? Since the story of resurrection was quite fantastical, they decided to create their own alternative facts. They bribed the guards with a healthy sum of money and instructed them to spread the story that Jesus' disciples had come during the night and had stolen Jesus' body away. They were assured that they would face no prosecution over this. But the women would later need to live with that widely circulated lie. In a later text, we're told that the women ran to tell the other disciples, about the resurrection, and they were met with the same attitude of, that just doesn't happen. The cloistered disciples regarded the women's story as nonsense, and yet they were undeterred. They had been in some hard places and had made some hard choices. They were prepared for this headwind because they knew something had happened. How do we respond when we're met with disbelief or even ridicule? How do we respond when we are faced with blatant untruths? What are we to do when something happens, something beyond explanation? Do we find ourselves second guessing, fearful to take a stand so that we won't discredit ourselves? If we find ourselves confronted with inexplicable events and, and begin to fear for our safety or our reputation within our particular group, we may also be tempted to create a workaround. If we feel our very existence depends on maintaining the status quo, as the guards did, we too may become very creative in fabricating stories that protect the status quo and in turn then seem to protect us. The women had not created those defenses. They saw no need to avoid what they had observed and had been told. So their boldness and courage put them in a position to recognize resurrection. Something happens when we refuse self-protection and defensiveness, simply being willing to accept the story as it unfolds. Light bursts forth when there is no other way. This is when hope dawns. Today is the 53rd anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In his final speech that night before his death, he told his audience and the world, and I quote, "We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter to me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as the people will get to the promised land," end quote. Commemorating Dr. King's life, legacy, and his unflinching challenge to the American people on this Resurrection Day could not be more fitting. Dr. King had seen the promised land, the land that resurrection heralds, the day when something happens. Who goes into the streets, into the darkness, when there's been a riot that led to a bloody end? People who protested the murders of Trayvon Martin, Freddie Gray, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the names go on and on and on. Those who protested the attacks against the Sikh community, the Asian American Pacific Islander community, the community of El Paso, Texas, where 23 people were gunned down in a Walmart. All named and unnamed people form a long procession from that dark morning when brave, persistent women ventured out, not knowing they would experience resurrection hope. Long processions continued before and after Dr. King's assassination. The processions continue to this day. All are people clouded by trauma, yet propelled by it. These women of the resurrection had a history of choosing to embrace hard things. Pushing ahead despite the odds put them into a position where they could see and receive the news of betrayal and death, but also of resurrection and hope. The other disciples had not been at the cross. They were not at the tomb. Because they initially dismissed the resurrection message, they almost missed it. Imagine if a few of them had not run back to determine for themselves that the women's report was actually accurate. The women were brave. They knew their why. They had nothing to lose. With their resolve to follow the path, one decision, one action, one step at a time, they made room for the new. British theologian N.T. Wright discusses the resurrection at length, pointing out that while there has never been agreement among theologians about exactly what the resurrection entailed or how this event unfolded, there is complete agreement that something happened. Everything shifted. This shift happened without human intervention, and it happened without human understanding. But the resurrection of Christ has shifted the trajectory of history. It's not resurrection if something doesn't happen. It's not resurrection if it doesn't shake us to the core, if it doesn't center those who typically are without power, if it doesn't demand everything of us, unless it cracks open the prevailing lies of the system. The dawn has announced itself. There is a call for courageous, undeterred people to go into the darkness despite the risks. Resurrection always surprises us because something happens, something we can't understand, yet we see the effects of. Darkness gives way to light gradually, breathtakingly, yet ever so steadily and surely. Light bursts forth when there is no known way forward. Because of the resurrection of Christ, we now can expect something to happen. Amen.